My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 28 years old. People often mistake calmness for weakness, but what they don't realize is that silence can hide storms. When I walked across that stage at graduation, cap and gown pressed perfectly, my smile didn't show the years of pain I had buried deep inside. Behind the applause, behind the camera flashes and proud words, I carried a truth so sharp it could slice through any joy. I wasn't celebrating a degree that day. I was celebrating the beginning of my revenge. You see, my grandparents had raised me when my parents died in a car crash I barely survived. They were kind, gentle, and rich, not just in money, but in heart. Their mansion sat on a hill overlooking the valley, surrounded by gardens my grandmother planted with her own hands. To the world, they were respected philanthropists. To me, they were the reason I believed love could still exist in a world so cruel. Until the night everything changed, it happened when I was 16. I still remember the scent of rain on the night air, the crackle of thunder echoing through the corridors of the house, and the faint trembling of my grandmother's hands as she poured tea for our unexpected guests, my uncle Richard, his wife Monica, and their son Tyler. They had never visited before without wanting something. That night, their eyes were hungrier than ever. I watched from the staircase as voices rose. My grandfather's deep tone tried to stay calm, but I heard the word will repeated over and over. Within days, both my grandparents were dead. A gas leak that destroyed their home and their lives. But I knew it wasn't an accident. The fire took everything, except me. I was found unconscious at the edge of the property, my hands burned, my memory fractured. The police ruled it accidental, but I knew the truth. I saw a shadow moving through the flames that night, my uncle's tall frame, standing where no innocent man would be. For years, I carried that secret, hiding it under layers of grief and obedience. Richard became my guardian, pretending to care while selling off what was left of my grandparents' empire. He turned their charity foundation into a tool for laundering money, marrying his son into wealth, and climbing the social ladder. I stayed quiet because I had nothing, no power, no proof, no allies. But I had memory and patience. Those two things became my fuel. When I turned 18, I left his mansion with nothing but a scholarship and a silent vow. I will take back everything you stole. And when I do, you'll never see it coming. When I graduated from business school, no one knew what I had been building. Every exam, every internship, every sleepless night, it wasn't for a future job. It was for justice. I had spent years studying law, corporate finance, and estate management for one purpose only: to reclaim what was mine. My grandparents' estate, valued at over $10 million, had been transferred through shell companies, all controlled by Richard. But what he didn't know was that I had found the loophole in his plan. The estate was never legally his. I'd been working quietly with an old family lawyer who had owed my grandfather his life. Together, we found a clause hidden in the foundation's founding documents that allowed the estate to revert to a direct heir, me, upon the exposure of fraud. The day I graduated, I didn't just walk across the stage, I walked into power. My revenge wasn't going to be loud or violent. It was going to be poetic. I quietly filed the paperwork, placing the entire estate under my name through legal means, without Richard even realizing. Overnight, everything he'd stolen was back in my hands. But that was only step one. I didn't want to just take his money. I wanted to take what he valued most: his pride, his name, his perfect family image. That's when I started crafting the plan that would make him crumble from the inside. The first weeks after graduation felt unreal, like walking through a life I had only ever seen in drafts and whispered plans. I moved with surgical calm, signing papers with the old family lawyer at my side while Richard continued his life of careless indulgence, convinced that nothing could touch him. He still stood at the top of his little empire, smiling in society columns, attending galas, making speeches about charity while his hands did the opposite. He had become expert at the theater of respectability. People applauded the show and never looked backstage. That's exactly where I would strike. I didn't explode my victory in his face the moment the estate reverted to me. Brashness is a poor weapon against men like him. Pride and subtlety are far more lethal. Instead, I moved like water around a stone, patient and steady, letting his hubris do the work for me. First, I closed the circle of ownership quietly. I placed the mansion and its holdings into a trust that I controlled, but set the paperwork so Richard would still think he was signing authorizations for routine transfers. He'd signed too many documents in a lifetime to read them properly. He hadn't noticed the few clauses that gave me trustee powers and oversight. Then I set about the long, quieter work, rebuilding reputation, planting seeds, gathering proof. I reopened the foundation under the same name my grandparents used, but this time with transparency, audited accounts, and legitimate partners. I hired people with no loyalty to Richard, accountants who asked difficult questions, legal analysts who didn't flinch at tracing shell companies, IT specialists who could follow financial threads into dark corners. I paid them in cash under aliases, if I had to. I learned every ledger line, every allowed loophole he had exploited, and I began to stitch a record that would stand up under scrutiny. While he spent money on private jets and jewelry, I spent mine on investigators who loved puzzles and on PR people who knew how to make truth unavoidable. I let him keep the trimmings of his life so long as he never looked down the road he was walking. Arrogance makes a man walk blind. I trained myself to be boring to him. That was part of the plan. When a wolf believes the lamb is unremarkable, the lamb can walk into the clearing and strike. Publicly, I played the dutiful niece who had returned to rescue, the family legacy, smiling at his jokes at charity breakfasts and agreeing to photo ops where he wrapped an arm around my shoulders. People who had abused him for their amusement nodded approvingly, thinking I was naive and grateful. Privately, I carved out our timelines, where money had moved, to whom, under what names. I found a string of shell companies that led to a small island trust and to accounts that paid for his friends' private pleasures. I found invoices for repairs that never occurred, for consultations that were meetings with his cronies. I mapped it all visually, turning his empire of lies into a simple diagram. When you take a map into a maze, the exit becomes obvious. I also began to reclaim the house and the things he had sold, not because I needed to own the objects, but because symbols matter. He had sold my grandmother's piano to a buyer across town. I bought it back and had it returned quietly to its place in the drawing room. I found the box of letters my grandfather had kept in his study and had them digitized and made redundant copies stored with lawyers who had no loyalty to Richard. Little things, perhaps, but they were bones of the family he had thought he could trample without consequence. The deeper my investigation went, the more I realized the truth. Richard had not only stolen money, he had rewired the family story so that no one would believe the real cause of the fire. He had forged signatures, muted certain people with bribes, bought quiet from suppliers who knew too much, and turned public opinion by funding the right people. He had become a small god in our corner of the city, and gods are notoriously careless about small human costs. So I needed more than balance sheets. I needed to create a stage where his lies would look ridiculous and unsalvageable. The plan that came to me was cruel in its own art. Let him keep his audience, then remove the stage beneath him. I would host a reunion, a gala under the Foundation's name, and invite every face who mattered to his world, his business partners, the journalists who ate from his hand, the socialites who basked in his reflected light. I booked the old ballroom at the same club where he had first toasted the fortune he thought he had built. I made sure the guest list read like a ledger of his pride. Then, over the weeks, I fed the lawyers and investigators small, incontrovertible facts tied to specific people in that audience, things you cannot explain away with a smile or a slick apology. A contractor who had been paid for renovations that never happened. A supplier who received payments for services performed in countries where no such service was rendered. a tax-exempt grant that ended up funding a private yacht. Each thread was dull on its own, but placed together on a table they formed a picture no spin doctor could bleach. I hired a forensic accountant with a taste for headlines and an ethics code like a sword. He agreed to testify publicly if needed. I also made alliances. An editor at a local paper who owed my grandfather for printing a charitable ad years ago, an old friend of my grandmother who had never felt comfortable at Richard's parties but had kept her mouth shut. I gave them reasons to speak. People like to be rescued from guilt. Give them a stage to speak on, and they will take it. There was another play I ran in parallel, more personal and delicate. I reached out to Tyler, Richard's son. I approached not with threats but with kindness and patience, knowing that the child in him had been taught cruelty by example. We met under the guise of family reconciliation, coffee, awkward apologies, the kind of small talk that tests sincerity. Tyler was young, ambitious, and complicated. He had the arrogance of youth and the fear of being cut off from the lifestyle he'd always known. I let him talk, and when he did, he revealed things he thought nobody linked to him. Late-night meetings, names of executives, passing comments that slipped like small keys into locks. I fed him stories of my grandparents' legacy, of what they meant to me, of the harm of erasing truth for money. I watched as the scales gradually tipped. He began to listen to the idea that his life could mean something beyond being an extension of his father's greed. The human inside him still existed. Pride had only hidden it. I didn't manipulate him as much as I offered a mirror. Your choices will define you. It's surprising how often someone's conscience is the most fragile thing we can mend. And slowly, like a quiet thaw, he started to give me small things, an email chain, a ledger entry he saw on his father's desk, a name of a middleman. Not enough to ruin the man outright, but enough to build texture. 1 week before the gala, I made my motion public. I convened the foundation board and requested a full, independent audit. Richard laughed in the hallway as he walked by. His laugh was a canyon I had learned to ignore. The auditors were thorough and fast. The tiny discrepancies that would have slipped past an eager board were now magnified, documented, and time-stamped. As the evidence accumulated, I made another subtle move. I approached the board with a transparency initiative and offered to become the chair, not as a power grab, but as an act of restoration. They accepted me because the public still trusted the foundation's name and because Richard had made himself indispensable through years of spectacle. They didn't expect me to be efficient. They didn't expect me to read the fine print in contracts. They didn't expect me to compile everything into a dossier that could be presented with grace and with legal karma. When the night of the gala arrived, I stood in the very same room Richard had always used to fashion his image, and I felt nothing but the satisfying coldness of inevitability. People moved like actors around me, oblivious to the script I had written for them. I smiled, welcomed guests, and raised a glass to memory. My grandparents' memory, while in the next room the forensic team prepared to hand an envelope to a trusted journalist. The lights were bright, the orchestra tuning, and somewhere in the back of the hall Richard adjusted his cufflinks, never once imagining the curtain that was about to fall. The music swelled through the ballroom like honey poured over glass, rich and glittering, masking the tension that coiled beneath my calm exterior. I stood near the grand staircase, the same staircase where my grandmother once greeted foreign diplomats, poets, and artists who had adored her sincerity. Now it was filled with people who only adored their own reflections, orbiting around Richard like moths around a dying flame. He thrived in that attention. Every handshake, every compliment, every whisper of admiration was fuel to his delusion. I watched him from a distance, glass of champagne in hand, smiling the way one does at a distant performance. He had no idea that by the end of the night, his empire would begin to disintegrate, not with an explosion, but with quiet, calculated precision. I didn't intend to humiliate him publicly. Humiliation invites sympathy, and men like him always find it. No, I intended something more haunting: isolation. The moment when the room realizes you are not who you pretend to be, and the applause dies because no one believes the act anymore. The first strike came not from me but from the journalist I had prepared. At precisely 9 o'clock, while the champagne still sparkled and laughter echoed, an alert went out, a story published online with supporting documents, sourced and verified. Charity funds misused. Investigators trace millions to private accounts. The article was calm, factual, devastating. Screens began to glow across the ballroom, notifications pinging like tiny alarms. At first, no one said anything. A few people scrolled, frowned, whispered. Then the ripple spread. Conversations faltered. Richard, halfway through a self-congratulatory toast, noticed the shift in energy. His voice stumbled over a word. Someone coughed. A waiter paused mid-step. Within seconds, phones were being passed hand to hand. Faces turned. Laughter ceased. I could almost hear the air thinning. He demanded to know what was happening, that booming voice of control cracking as he grabbed a colleague's phone. I saw the color drain from his face as he read his own name printed beneath the headline. That was the first moment he looked small, not because of guilt, but because of fear. Fear of exposure, of losing the illusion he had built brick by brick out of lies. I didn't move toward him. I let the silence do what I could not. The orchestra faltered, stopped, and the entire room became an audience to his unraveling. He tried to recover, of course. He always did. "This is slander," he shouted, slamming the phone on a table. "Fake documents. Lies from envious people." The predictable defense of a man who had lived too long in deceit. A few nodded half-heartedly. Others stepped back. I saw partners whisper to their assistants, already calculating the damage. In their world, loyalty lasts only until headlines change. I let him rage. Every denial he made tightened the rope he had thrown over his own neck. I approached him finally, my expression soft, concerned, the mask of the innocent. "Richard," I said quietly, "maybe we should step outside." He turned on me like a cornered animal, eyes blazing. You did this. You think you can ruin me." His voice cracked through the hall, echoing. I simply looked at him, my calm a weapon sharper than his fury. "I didn't ruin you, Richard," I said evenly. "You did that all by yourself. I just stopped covering for you." The words landed like stones on marble. Gasps moved through the crowd. Cameras flashed. The story had its picture now, the perfect tableau of downfall. Security escorted him out not long after that. He was still shouting about conspiracies, threats of lawsuits, the predictable spiral of a man who realized he had lost the audience. I followed a few steps behind, not to gloat but to finish what I started. Outside, under the floodlights, he turned to me one last time. "You think they'll love you for this?" he hissed. "You think they'll forgive you?" I met his eyes, cold and steady. "I don't need their forgiveness, Richard. I just need the truth." Then I walked back inside, leaving him in the silence he had earned. That night, as guests slipped away, murmuring, pretending they had always suspected something, I sat alone at my grandparents' table in the corner of the ballroom. The pianist, unaware of the chaos, began playing softly again, the same melody my grandmother used to hum. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace. But peace is never permanent. The storm that follows victory is often quieter, darker, and more dangerous. Over the next weeks, the fallout unfolded exactly as I had predicted. The investigation widened, the authorities seized assets, and the Foundation's name was restored in public opinion. My face appeared in interviews, not as a hero, but as a quiet restorer of legacy. They called me the calm inheritor, a nickname that both amused and exhausted me. Beneath that calm exterior, I was still haunted by memories of my grandparents, of the fire, of the years Richard stole. Revenge gives you a purpose, but not healing. Healing demands truth, and truth is often heavier than vengeance itself. I visited their graves one evening. As dusk turned the sky violet, I laid a single lily on each stone and whispered, "It's done." But even as I said it, a part of me knew it wasn't. Because in the ashes of revenge, something else begins: accountability, yes, but also loneliness. Once the war is won, what do you do with the silence that follows? I returned to the estate, my estate now, and walked its long hallways. Every step echoed with memory. The portraits of my grandparents seemed to watch me with quiet approval. I sat in my grandfather's study, opened one of his old journals, and read a passage I had never noticed before. To love justice is to risk your peace, but to ignore it is to lose your soul. I realized then that what I had done was never just revenge, it was survival. I had carried the burden of truth for years, disguised as patience, delivered as retribution. And yet, as I sat there under the golden lamplight, I understood something else. Richard's downfall was not the end of the story. The inheritance, the estate, the justice, they were all pieces of something larger. My grandparents had built a legacy not of wealth, but of integrity. My task now was to protect that, to ensure it didn't rot under the same greed that once destroyed it. I closed the journal, exhaled, and finally allowed myself to smile, not a triumphant smile, but a tired, human one. Because real revenge, I realized, is not about destroying your enemy. It's about reclaiming yourself from their shadow. The weeks that followed were strange, almost disorienting. You spend so long building your life around vengeance that when it's done, you don't quite know who you are anymore. Every morning I woke up to silence, the kind of silence that used to suffocate me when I lived under Richard's roof, but now it felt like freedom. My phone buzzed constantly, reporters asking for interviews, people offering documentaries, publishers wanting book rights, but I ignored them all. They wanted the scandal, not the story. They wanted to turn my grandparents' pain into a headline. No, I wanted something different. I wanted the world to remember them not as victims, but as visionaries. So I poured everything into restoring their charity foundation. I reopened the education fund for underprivileged children, the one Richard had turned into a money pit. I built a new shelter on the edge of the estate and named it Carter House, after my grandmother, whose kindness had once changed so many lives. It felt poetic, reclaiming what was stolen and using it for good again. For the first time since the fire, I could walk through the gardens without feeling like a ghost in my own memory. But healing isn't linear, and peace doesn't erase scars. Some nights, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the smell of smoke still in my lungs, hearing echoes of my grandfather's voice shouting for me to run. Therapy helped, but so did work. Not corporate work, not profit-driven ambition, but real, human effort. I volunteered at the schools my grandparents once supported. The children didn't know my story, and I liked it that way. They just called me Miss Emily and asked if I'd tell them stories about the big house on the hill. Sometimes I did. I told them about the rose garden, about my grandmother's piano, about how my grandfather believed that money meant nothing if it didn't build hope. I never told them about Richard. He didn't deserve a place in their imagination. Slowly, those moments began to heal me, not by forgetting the pain, but by giving it meaning. One evening, while I was going through old files in the study, I found a letter tucked behind a framed photo of my grandparents. The handwriting was my grandfather's, steady and elegant. It was dated 2 days before the fire. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It wasn't a will or a legal note. It was a message addressed to me. Emily, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. Remember what we taught you. Truth outlives lies, and love outlasts greed. Don't let anger make your choices. When the time comes, act with purpose, not hate. I sat there for a long time, staring at the words. Tears came, not because I was sad, but because I realized he had seen it coming. They had known Richard's greed could destroy them, and they trusted me, even as a child, to set things right. I whispered, I did it, Grandpa. I kept my promise. But the past has a way of clawing back, no matter how far you move forward. One afternoon, I received a letter from a correctional facility. It was from Richard. I almost threw it away, but curiosity, or maybe closure, made me open it. The letter was short, bitter, desperate. He wrote that he wanted to see me, that he was sorry, that he had something to tell me about that night, something I didn't know. For a moment, the room felt cold again. I didn't owe him anything, but part of me wanted to hear it. Closure is a tricky thing. It often disguises itself as curiosity. So, a week later, I visited him. The prison smelled of metal and bleach. When he saw me, his eyes were hollow, his voice cracked. "You think you know everything, Emily," he rasped. But I wasn't the one who started that fire. I froze. "What are you talking about?" He leaned closer, the shadow of his former arrogance flickering in his eyes. "It was Monica," he said. "Your sweet aunt. She wanted it all. I covered for her because I loved her." The words hit like a blow to the chest. My aunt, the woman who used to braid my hair, who cried at the funeral, who sent me empty birthday cards for years. She had lit the match? It felt impossible. But as I left the prison, fragments of memories began to rearrange themselves. Monica arguing with my grandparents about inheritance, her perfume lingering in the hall that night, the sound of her car leaving just before the explosion. It all made sense now. And for the first time, I didn't feel rage. I felt exhaustion. Revenge had already taken enough of my life. I couldn't let it consume another decade. I chose not to pursue her. The law already had Richard, and Monica would live with her guilt, just as I had lived with my scars. Sometimes, the cruelest punishment is to let a guilty person live with the weight of their truth. That night, as I stood on the balcony overlooking the valley, I felt something shift inside me, not victory, not relief, but release. The air was crisp, the stars clearer than I remembered. I whispered into the wind, "It's really over this time." And I meant it. I finally understood what my grandfather had written, that revenge gives you fire, but forgiveness gives you freedom. Both are painful, but only one lets you move forward. I turned away from the horizon and walked back inside, toward the future I had fought so hard to reclaim. Months passed, and though the estate had been restored to its old glory, it no longer symbolized wealth or power. It represented rebirth. Every corner of that mansion told a different story now. The grand dining hall that once echoed with arguments now hosted fundraisers for orphaned children. The ballroom, where greed had once danced in silk and champagne, was now filled with laughter, art, and music from kids whose dreams had once been silenced by poverty. I no longer lived in the house. I lived through its purpose. The legacy my grandparents left was alive again, not in money, but in meaning. Sometimes, I'd walk through the garden and talk to them, as if they were still there. "We did it," I'd whisper, tracing the carvings on the old oak bench. "We made it matter again." And in the silence that followed, I could almost hear my grandmother's soft laugh, the same one that used to make everything feel right, no matter how wrong the world seemed. But one evening, just as I was leaving the office, I got an email with no subject line. The sender was anonymous, but the message was just one line: "Truth is never as clean as you think." Attached was a file. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside were financial statements, wire transfers, and photos, all showing that the fire insurance money from the estate's first claim had been funneled into an offshore account under my grandmother's name. My heart stopped. For a second, I thought it had to be fake. But the documents were too detailed, too precise. My grandmother? The woman who taught me that honesty was the highest currency? My mind raced. Was she hiding money? Was she planning to escape? Or had someone forged her name to cover their crime? Suddenly, everything I thought I knew was uncertain again. I spent days digging, contacting lawyers, tracing the files. In the end, I learned the truth. My grandmother had opened the account, but not for herself. She had been funneling money to protect families who were being blackmailed by Richard's company. She'd hidden it so no one could trace it back to her. The scandal was her final act of rebellion, her secret war against the man who eventually destroyed her. That discovery shattered me and healed me all at once. It reminded me that heroes aren't perfect, they're human. My grandparents weren't saints. They were people who made hard choices, who fought their battles quietly, who tried to protect others even when it cost them everything. And suddenly, my revenge didn't feel like vengeance anymore. It felt like continuation, like I'd carried their fight across the finish line. I finally felt proud, not just of what I'd done, but of who I'd become. Not the angry orphan who swore to destroy, but the woman who learned to rebuild. When I stood in front of the board of the Carter Foundation to announce a new scholarship program for veterans' families, my hands didn't shake. My voice didn't break. I looked out at the crowd, strangers, survivors, dreamers, and I said, "This isn't just about money. It's about giving pain a purpose." Because no one heals by hoarding what broke them. The applause that followed wasn't just for me. It was for every life my grandparents had touched, and every one that I would. Years later, I wrote a book. Not a tell-all, not a confession, but a story. I called it The Fire Beneath the Roses. It became a quiet bestseller, not because it was scandalous, but because it was honest. I didn't change names. I didn't hide my scars. I told the truth, the whole, messy, human truth. And one day, after a book signing in a small town, a little girl came up to me and said, "Miss Emily, I want to be brave like you." I smiled and said, "You already are. You just don't know it yet." That was the moment I realized my revenge had turned into something much greater. It had become a legacy of courage. Sometimes I still visit my grandparents' graves. I bring white roses and sit for hours, telling them everything. The letters, the lies, the truths that came too late. The wind moves through the trees, soft and forgiving, and I swear I can feel them listening. One evening, as I stood to leave, a young woman approached. She said she'd been one of the scholarship recipients, the first in her family to graduate college. She hugged me and whispered, "You changed my life." I drove home in silence, tears streaming down my face, and for the first time in years, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. Revenge had started my story, but redemption had written the ending. If you've ever carried pain so heavy it shaped who you are, remember this: you can turn it into power. You can turn every wound into a weapon for good. My name is Emily Carter, and this was my story, a story not just of revenge, but of reclamation, of rebuilding what evil tried to erase.